the well-known book, The Post-Anarchism, published in 2015, and the second one, Political Theology, published in 2018. So, in introducing Sol Њумен and approaching to his work, we have to ask two main questions into the context of the work of the Museum of Contemporary Art and also into the context of this program. The first one is why we need political theory in the work of artists. And actually, this question addresses one of the main premises of the program, of interdisciplinary program, namely disordering the art world, relates to the changing notion of art. Actually, as a result of the crisis we are living through, the cultural and artistic dynamic is transformed as society, as a wider society as well. So actually, the art world that was situated before is not longer operative. For that reason, we need lenses from the political theory and concepts, especially because artists transgress into the field of politics and they connect it to social movements, also to the political activist groups. And the second question, equally important, is why we need post-anarchist theory. And I will refer to Sol Њумен's book, Post-Anarchism, where in the very beginning he explains about categories such as autonomy and freedom, about about the social and political, a new social, political and ethical horizon, about alternatives of our social orders. All these points, which are incorporated today in the work of artists and artistic groups. And finally, in this line of reasoning, if I put this session in the continuation of the previous two, for example, in the case of Claire Bishop, she presented cases of intervention, artistic intervention in the public spaces, in the main streets, squares, where this political commodification is disturbed by artists, or more explicitly by Coco Fusco, who actually was talking about artists, Cuban artists against the state, based on Hannah Arendt's argument, the right to have rights, as a main lens to consider work of art today. And for that reason, naturally, artists and artistic collectives intersects with the post-anarchist approaches. Thank you. So, please follow.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is it okay? All right, good.
Probably a bit closer.
A bit closer, right? Yeah. Excellent. All right, lovely. How's that? Is that better? Can you hear me up the back? Good. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and I'm glad to see some people have actually turned up tonight, and you've chosen to come here rather than to go to the political rally that's taking place outside, actually. Hopefully, hopefully you won't be too disappointed, because I'm going to be talking about politics tonight, although no doubt a form of politics of a very different kind to electoral politics. I'm going to be talking about anarchism, anarchist political theory, and what I call post-anarchism, which is a post-structuralist reinterpretation of anarchism, and I'm going to try to apply this to contemporary art and critical art practices. Turns out I don't know much about contemporary art. I mistook a circle of chairs arranged downstairs in the gallery tonight. I mistook it simply for a circle of chairs, and I was told it was actually an installation. So. That testifies to my expertise in contemporary art. But nevertheless, well, look, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and I'd like to thank my generous host, Tiemir Topozovsky, and the Museum of Contemporary Art. And I really think this whole series of cultural events, where you have sort of theorists, political theorists, philosophers talk about contemporary art, is a really fantastic idea, and I'm very happy and very honoured to be part of this program of events. Okay, so I'm going to, this talk's going to be mostly theoretical, but I have a few images that I'd like to show you as well, actually by way of example. So, it seems to me that today one of the major questions which artists have to confront is how to retain a critical distance from the system of social and economic relations that they're also at the same time compelled to be part of? How are they to maintain a kind of an autonomous position in relation to institutions which they depend upon for recognition or funding? How are they to resist the commodification of their work and the recuperation of their ideas and practices by the capitalist market, whose hegemony they also oppose, and yet whose circulation they are necessarily involved in and often perpetuate? So, as many theorists and artists have pointed out, the spectacular society, of course, referring to Guy Debord's notion of the society of the spectacle, the spectacular society in which the fetishism of commodities finds its ultimate form under late capitalism in the circulation of images, renders the critical and political capacities of art today highly ambiguous. And this is especially true, of course, when the political realm itself has become virtually indistinguishable from the mediatic spectacle, and when the proliferation of what we call fake news, post-truth, and conspiracy theories becomes something like an art form in itself. So when power becomes a parody of itself, when, for instance, the far right has effectively become today's radical counterculture, where they've taken over the certain kind of terrain of transgression and liberation from the left, then surely the critical role of the artist in, if you like, unmasking or exposing its imposture becomes somewhat redundant. So when power to some degree becomes anarchic and starts, if you like, dismantling or undermining the established rules and norms of political discourse, then what kind of role remains for the critical artist? And this is really the question which I'm trying to grapple with in this talk tonight. What critical function remains for art today? At the same time, many contemporary artists see themselves as creating a new kind of critical political space in which major issues such as war or state violence or surveillance or consumerism or the exclusion of migrants or practices of bordering or, of course, ecological destruction, where these issues are explored. Right? So it may be that today art offers one of the few remaining spaces available for a philosophical and critical reflection on major political and social and economic questions. So perhaps critical art can in a way open up an alternative public space, one which exists, if you like, in the interstices or the cracks or the margins between state institutions and the marketplace, and which also in a way aims to escape these kinds of forces and institutions and to create something which is new and different and autonomous to some extent. Although autonomy, as I try to point out, is never a kind of a pure concept. One can never be truly autonomous from the power one opposes. You're always to some degree caught up within the power relations that you're at the same time resisting and critiquing. So what I'm talking about is not exactly a utopia of art practices, because this is too permanent or static a concept, but rather what we might call a heterotopia, and this is Foucault's idea of these kinds of temporary alternative spaces, if you like. I think that's probably a more relevant way of describing it. Spaces in which existing social relations are temporarily suspended and alternatives can be experimented with. And there's numerous examples of this, of course, in contemporary art. Some time ago, Nicolas Bourriard coined the term relational aesthetics to describe the emerging form taken by contemporary art. So art comes to be seen as a sort of laboratory for experimenting with new relationships outside normal social existence. And he uses the expression hands-on utopias to think about these spaces. But at the same time, I don't think that we should be naive about the critical power of these alternative spaces, because they're all also to some degree caught within the institutional and market dynamics of the system which they claim to be opposing. Claire Bishop some time ago pointed to the ambiguous nature of much participatory art today, questioning its political importance and its emancipatory claims. And she shows how the obsession with artistic collaboration and public participation in art is often reflective of a certain neoliberal rationality that measures aesthetic value in terms of public engagement. So there's a risk, in other words, that contemporary art becomes like a model not so much for critical political practice and thought, but rather for the sort of public-private partnerships which which neoliberalism has been has tried to generate or promote. Moreover, the very idea of participation has become, if you like, the central fetish in the age of communicative capitalism. We're always being called upon to participate, to engage. With my students at university, we have to try to engage the student. We have to try to get them to participate. It becomes almost like a sort of fetishistic concept in the contemporary age. So this is the era of sort of perpetual connectivity and instantaneous communication, which is very much part of this, where we're all expected to be kind of actively engaged and perpetually stimulated all the time. And here I'm very much inclined to agree with the philosopher Jacques Rancière, who, in his sort of critique of these kinds of ideas, argues that there's something condescending and even infantilizing in the premise upon which certain forms of participatory art are based, that the private aesthetic experience is a form of apathy or a kind of an ideological slumber that the audience has to be violently shaken out of. He's very, very critical of that idea, and to some degree I think is right, actually. Excuse me. At the same time, I do believe that there's something genuinely, or there's genuinely radical potential in many contemporary art practices, particularly those aimed at creating these kinds of alternative spaces. So, as Boryard points out, the role of artworks today is no longer to form imaginary and utopian realities, but to actually be ways of living and models of action within the real, right? So in other words, that they constitute new forms of social interaction. The idea of an artistic space as a new kind of public sphere, a space of critical political engagement and experimentation, where the walls, if you like, or the sort of the silos, the division between the public and the artist, between the gallery and the city, between an exhibition and everyday life, are broken down or at least questioned or at least problematized. And I think this is a very important and urgent task in the world today. So what I want to do, as I said, is explore what I see as some of the philosophical and theoretical ideas which underpin this new nexus which is emerging between art and politics. And here I want to focus on anarchism. Why anarchism, you might ask? Well, that's a very good question. But I think, as I'll try to show, there's a clear affinity or a clear relationship or an association between critical art practices and anarchism as a philosophy and a kind of a form of ethics and a form of political action. And I don't think this link has really been all that extensively explored in the past. Many artists today, and indeed in the past, have drawn inspiration from the anti-authoritarian ethos of anarchism, from its emphasis on radical freedom and autonomy, as well as its revolutionary project of overthrowing the existing order of power and domination. Now, I think what makes the relationship between anarchism and critical art practices particularly important is the notion of what's called prefiguration, which has always been central to anarchist philosophy. And prefiguration is the idea that the type of politics that you engage in, or that you pursue, should already critically reflect or prefigure the type of society which you want to create, right? Or the kinds of social relations which you want to try to generate through these practices. In other words, that there should be a close relationship between revolutionary action and the principles of a post-revolutionary society. So prefiguration, as I understand it, is a kind of an anti-strategic ethical impulse. Right? It's the idea that one's moral principles should not be compromised or sacrificed to the exigencies of power, the exigencies of politics, that the ends do not always justify the means. For instance, if you want to build a society without violence, then you should not use violent means to achieve that type of society. If you want to create a society without domination, then you shouldn't use authoritarian and sort of vanguardist measures or forms of political organisation to try to achieve that. It should be, in other words, a relationship, in other words, between the means and the ends, right? So, so I think if we understand prefiguration in this way, this means that it also implies something to do with creating the conditions for a liberated society in the present, rather than projected into some kind of imagined future. In other words, a revolution in the here and now, rather than waiting for the great revolutionary event. And I think this idea is really quite key to anarchism. In the 19th century, the anarchist activist and thinker Mikhail Bakunin, a famous Russian revolutionary anarchist, drew a distinction between what he called the political revolution, which was about the seizure of power, the seizure of state power, on the one hand, and the social revolution on the other, right? And this was really, I suppose, the key conflict, which was sort of central to the politics of the First International between the followers of Marx, who preferred more authoritarian kind of revolutionary and vanguardist techniques of kind of seizing state power and utilizing the state to kind of build socialism. And the anarchists like Bakunin, who believed that the state itself was the problem, right? In other words, that you had to you can't use the state as a kind of an instrument of the revolution. The state is the first obstacle which needed to be removed as part of this revolutionary process. And this was really what Bakunin meant by what he called the social revolution as opposed to the political revolution. The political revolution is about seizing power and utilizing state power. The social revolution is about, as Bakunin put it, building autonomous or creating autonomous relationships and political forces which were outside the state, right? And that's really a kind of a key difference here, which I think in some ways is kind of what's going on with critical art practices, or at least some of them, anyway. So Bakunin believed that the social revolution would lead to kind of a moral transformation of society and human interactions. And this is an idea which other anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, the other very famous Russian anarchist, also argued. He believed that the social revolution would also allow our kind of natural disposition towards what he called mutual aid and assistance to emerge and to become the basis for a new kind of ethics of solidarity, equality, collective action, and autonomy. And he believed that this would be the basis, this would form the ethical and moral basis for a kind of a self-governing society without the state. Now I think this distinction between the political and social revolution is really very interesting, and I think it's been pursued by a number of contemporary philosophers like Giorgio Agamben, with his notion of what he calls destituent power. I don't know if you're familiar with Agamben's work, but it seems to me it's very much inspired by a certain kind of anarchism. The idea of destituent power also comes from Walter Benjamin's notion of divine violence, which he associates with the destruction of the state. And it's also, in some ways, related to Georges Sorel's idea of the proletarian general strike. And destituent power, what Agamben calls destituent power, is kind of a mode of action which seeks neither to preserve the existing legal and political order, nor is it about overthrowing it in some kind of violent revolution, because in a way this simply reinvents the order which one seeks to destroy, paradoxically, right? So, this is why most revolutions have been a failure, because they've simply reinvented power. They've destroyed one order of power, and they've created another system or another state in its place, right? So destituent power, as opposed to constituted or constituting power, is something quite different. Destituent power, according to Agamben, is a form of action which is about deposing, as he puts it, deposing legal and political authority, or suspending it, or rendering it inoperative, right? And also about fostering autonomous forms of life and existence which are outside of the kind of the grasp of legal and political authority. So I'm linking all of this back to the idea of prefiguration, and I think I would argue that prefiguration can actually tell us something quite important about critical art practices today. In transforming collective spaces, in the relationship between the artist and the audience, between objects, images, spectators, and so on, artists can also try to create a certain kind of social revolution in the present, in the here and now, and they try to effect or create or construct new forms of autonomous relations between people that are outside of the immediate control of institutions, and which in their very existence, even if this is a kind of a temporary situation, in their very existence aim at a suspension of capitalist and state relations. Right? So in other words, in seeking to kind of modify relations in the aesthetic register, this has the potential to modify ethical and political relations as well. At the very least, these practices are designed to make us question and reflect ethically on our everyday behaviour, on our subjectivity. In particular, the aim of many critical art practices is to foster relations of non-domination between individuals, and to develop non-hierarchical practices of interaction. An important aspect of anarchist practice involves, for instance, setting up autonomous organisations and spaces in the form of communities, free schools, social centres, libraries, and so on. There's been many examples of this, of course. Now, to give an example of a form of anarchist-inspired contemporary art, I'd refer to the work of Adelita Husni-Bey. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she explores possibilities of radical pedagogy or radical education, which is very much inspired by anarchism. And central to her work is the question of how we relate to one another in collective settings, and how the dynamics of power can sometimes disrupt and distort utopian projects. This is from one of her video installations from 2010-11 called Postcards from the Desert Island. And it involved workshops with school children who were asked to build an alternative utopian community on an imagined desert island. And they had to grapple with the difficulties of political decision making, with structures of power and authority, which inevitably arose. So even in this kind of imagined utopian situation, they still had to come to terms with the realities of power, with the need to make political decisions, who decides, what kinds of things are decided, etc. Right? So in a way, power always comes back into the picture, despite your best attempts to sort of transcend it or escape from it. Right? So in this way, the possibilities of alternative anarchistic relationships are tested with an encounter with their limits. Husni-Bey's intention is not to show the impossibility of such alternative communities, but to make us aware of their tensions, difficulties and limitations so that we can develop more effective strategies and ways of circumventing power. So the purpose here is to show us the importance of transforming relations between people at a micro-political and micro-ethical level. It's once again this idea that, to think about revolutionary politics, you have to kind of focus on the micro-political structures, what takes place at an individual level between people. It's not simply about these kinds of grand totalizing projects, it's about kind of ethical relations between individuals who kind of constitute social structures. And this is very much reflective of the German anarchist activist Gustav Landauer in the early 20th century. He had this idea that the state, what we call the state, with a capital S, is actually a social relationship or a series of social relationships, a certain way of people actually relating to one another. And as he put it, the state is destroyed by creating new social relationships, right? So once again, this kind of focus on the micro-political and people relating to one another in a different way, in a way which is not about trying to dominate or exert power over them, but developing more sort of egalitarian practices. A more recent example of this kind of art is from the Russian art collective Choto de l'Art. I think that's how you pronounce it, actually. Okay, well, I'll leave that to you. And this, which means what is to be done, which of course, was a very famous slogan from Lenin. But I think this group is much more inspired by anarchism, actually, rather by Leninism, Marxist-Leninism. And this is actually a exhibition from this year, actually, so it's just happened. It's called "And If I Devoted My Life to One of Its Feathers." And here they explore the idea of zapatismo, this kind of the Zapatista collective or commune in Chiapas in Mexico. Once again, a movement which is very much kind of inspired by anarchist principles of autonomy and decentralized, non-hierarchical forms of organization and so on. So this exhibition is about the Zapatismo way of life. It's about drawing upon, and it draws upon indigenous Mexican symbols, as you can see here, local traditions and myths, as well as reenacting the activist practices of the Zapatista autonomous communities in Chiapas. So what they did, they actually set up like a Zapatista training school in Russia. And so this was a way of kind of exploring the themes of survival and resistance, of kind of grassroots community building, developing alternative counter communities, and forms of existence which are kind of autonomous from, once again, from the state and from capitalism. So, it's no surprise that there's been a strong affinity or a strong relationship between anarchism and experimental art. Historically, of course, many artists have actually drawn inspiration from anarchism and vice versa. So we think of the social realism of Courbet in the, sorry, that's a picture of, by the way, the previous example I was talking about of this kind of experiment in Zapatismo. So Gustave Courbet, his famous work, The Stonebreakers, 1849, he was famous for depicting the lives of ordinary peasants and working class people without trying to sort of romanticize their lives, so trying to depict the reality of, and the hardships which they encountered and lived through. And Courbet was himself very much involved in revolutionary politics, particularly of the Paris Commune in 1871. Now the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, very famous anarchist, the first person to actually call himself an anarchist, by the way, was very much inspired by Courbet, and Courbet was very much inspired by him. He painted a portrait of Proudhon, as you can see here, in 1865 as a tribute to this very famous anarchist. The Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro also strongly identified with anarchism, as did Paul Signac. Avant-garde forms of art, such as Surrealism and Dada, particularly Duchamp, once again drew direct inspiration from anarchism, especially from the individualist anarchism of Max Stirner. And I'll have more to say about Stirner a bit later on. Post-World War II modernism also drew upon anarchist themes, and even the Situationist International, which was formally speaking a sort of a Marxist organization, in reality developed much more of a kind of a heterodox form of Marxism, which was really in many ways close to anarchism than it was to orthodox Marxism. Many other examples, of course, the critical art ensemble, which combines electronic media, digital and performing art with activism in order to highlight, for instance, the risks of biotechnology and military hardware. Other collectives and networks such as the Invisible Committee and Crime Think span radical activism, literary production and performance art as a critique of state violence, surveillance and control and the alienation of everyday life under capitalism. And moreover, the organisational structure of these kinds of art collectives reflect anarchist principles of horizontalism, decentralisation and affinity. And also I think the gesture of wearing masks, of course we're all wearing masks now, we've all become anarchists, haven't we, in some ways, but the anarchists have always been we're doing it for health reasons, but the anarchists have always been interested in wearing masks as a kind of a sort of a counter-surveillance measure. But also, I think it's more than this actually, it's not just about counter-surveillance, it's a certain kind of symbol of resistance to these, the society of, visibility and transparency. Right, so it's not just a way of kind of avoiding CCTV cameras, but it's a kind of it's a sort of a symbol of resistance against the surveillance society as well, isn't it? And so these can be seen as a kind of a powerful form of political performing art, and it's reminiscent of what Bakunin called, perhaps ironically, the invisible dictatorships. He wasn't really talking or proposing dictatorships, but invisible collectives of clandestine revolutionaries. Who would kind of go around sort of provoking revolutionary action. It's interesting to call them the invisible dictatorships, like the Invisible Committee that we hear about today. Now, another example of anarchist art is the picture of Banksy here. But Voyner was quite notorious for staging these kinds of, highly provocative, sort of public performance forms of art, actually, which were deliberately sort of antagonistic towards the Russian government. Highlighting issues such as, corruption, authoritarianism, homophobic and racist policies, the treatment of migrants, for instance, in Russia. So Voyner's interventions, many of which have actually seen him arrested and harassed and imprisoned by the police, have included, for instance, this one painting a giant penis, giant phallus on the bridge of St. Petersburg, staging a mock execution of migrant workers in a Moscow supermarket, overturning a number of police cars in what they with the police officers inside the cars, by the way, in what they called the Palace Revolution, and also using a giant laser beam to project a giant skull and crossbones on a Russian government building. Right. So these are, obviously sort of anarchistic confrontations with state power, and Voyner openly identify with anarchism. They declare themselves to be Makhnovites, in other words, the followers of the Ukrainian revolutionary anarchist Nestor Makhno, who was around at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, anyway, I guess it seems to me that there's a kind of an intrinsic relationship that needs to be explored here between anarchism and art. And even, modernism in art was essentially a form of a form of anarchism as a kind of a cultural form. So anarchism is not simply an anti-state or anti-authoritarian politics, but a whole movement of cultural rebellion and individual self-expression. Now, I would also suggest, however, that there's that within the history of this relationship between art and anarchism, there's been a certain kind of shift or resignification concerning the representation of social reality. In other words, whether there is a kind of an objective social reality out there which simply needs to be represented, or whether social reality is something to be created or invented or constructed. Perhaps we can talk here about the transition from, if you like, modernism to postmodernism, right? And in art, particularly art inspired and influenced by anarchism, we can, I guess, chart a similar kind of move from the social realism of the 19th century, people like Courbet, right, to avant-garde art, surrealism, Dada, etc., which specifically rejected the idea that art was or that the purpose of art was to actually represent an existing reality, right? So what the more avant-garde artists claimed or argued was that the purpose of art was to reimagine reality, not to represent it, but to reimagine it, to actually create it, and create it in different ways. And in the field of politics, I would suggest there's been a kind of a more recent shift from what I call classical anarchism, the anarchism of Bakunin, Kropotkin, Proudhon of the 19th century, right, to forms of post-structuralist inspired anarchism which emerged post-May 68, which is associated with the thinkers like Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari and so on. And this is what I call post-anarchism, right? So in the 19th century, artists like Proudhon and Bakunin believed that art should serve the cause of revolution by accurately depicting the real conditions of the working class, and should therefore play a role in moral and political education. The idea of the freedom of expression of the individual artist, while important, should be secondary, they argued, to the collective interest and the revolutionary struggle. So Kropotkin, for instance, believed that artists should be recruited to the cause of the revolution, and they should use their creative power as cultural workers for the purposes of revolutionary propaganda. Bakunin's attitude to art, which was actually quite interesting, which can perhaps be illustrated in the apocryphal story that during the Dresden Uprising of 1849 he proposed that the Sistine Madonna should be hung on the barricades as a deterrent against further attacks, which is really, in a way, perhaps the ultimate form of performance art, seemed to be that art should be wholly sacrificed to the needs of the revolution. And actually, ironically, this was the same kind of anti-art gesture adopted by many later avant-garde artists themselves. So perhaps Bakunin's somewhat nihilistic slogan, "The urge to destroy is also a creative urge," can be taken as the ultimate expression of the revolutionary role of art. In other words, turning the destructive impulse of revolution into a kind of a work of art, into a kind of a creative process, creative urge, as he puts it. Nevertheless, in classical anarchism, we find the idea that art, in its ability to portray social reality, has a role in our sentimental and political education, and was therefore an important tool of the revolutionary struggle, but at the same time was seen to be secondary to collective political goals. But I would suggest that later artistic movements, starting with Dada, challenged some of these earlier attitudes. And here I think we can talk about a genuinely anarchistic art form rather than one which was simply recruited to the political cause of anarchism. So, we talk about Duchamp, Man Ray, and others. We can refer here to an anarchism of the aesthetic register. Famous work by Duchamp, The Bride from 1912. And here we find a desire to kind of play around with established aesthetic forms and norms, and of course to break down the traditional hierarchies and institutions which dominated the art world, such as the art gallery as a kind of a rarefied and exclusive space of fine art. And central here is the break with the very notion of representation as such, with the expectation that the idea of art should simply depict social reality. Rather, the purpose of art in effecting displacements in the aesthetic register is to construct new visions of reality, rather than to simply reflect it. And lastly, there was a questioning of the collectivist politics of classical anarchism and a greater emphasis on individual autonomy. Artists such as, I've mentioned before Max Stirner's individualist and egoist anarchism, which had an important influence on Dada. And artists such as Duchamp, Max Ernst, Malevich, and Rodochenko were directly inspired by Max Stirner's radical assault in the ego on its own on the structures, philosophical structures and moral ideas of autonomy. So values and ideas such as humanity, morality, truth, society, freedom, and even revolution were what Max Stirner called spooks or ghosts, or fixed ideas, or in other words, ideological abstractions, which he wanted to kind of, dispel or destroy. So the focus on Stirner is on our power to not simply reflect external conditions, but to radically reconstruct them by first recreating ourselves. And this is really his whole project of egoism, what he calls egoism. In this emphasis on individual autonomy, the iconoclastic rejection of all established values, norms, ideals, and institutions, and in the idea of self-creation, we can see why Stirner's thinking appealed to avant-garde artists who also sought to defy social norms and aesthetic conventions. Furthermore, some of the positive forms of self-enacted cooperation that Stirner proposed as an alternative to the state and as an alternative to abstract conceptions of society and community would no doubt resonate with many art collectives today. For instance, his notion of what he called the Union of Egoists, a very interesting concept, as a kind of a self-determined voluntary association which individuals enter into freely. I mean, this seems to be very similar to sort of many artistic collectives or art collectives, which we find today actually. A kind of a sort of a self-activated autonomous group. Fluxus would be a good example of this kind of union of egoists. Anyway, so I wanted to say a bit about post-anarchism, my philosophy of post-anarchism, and why I think it's associated with much of contemporary critical art. So post-anarchism, just to be clear, is not or should not be seen to signify the end of anarchism, or that anarchism is over or finished, or this somehow supersedes anarchism. Rather, what I would say is that post-anarchism is an attempt to renew anarchist theory, to kind of reactivate it through a certain kind of deconstruction of its philosophical premises, if you like. So I think post-anarchism is a more appropriate or more relevant way of understanding new and emerging forms of critical art practice. That's my claim, anyway. So I think, post-anarchism, there's a number of different aspects of post-anarchism or principles which I can talk about. But I think where it differs or departs from classical anarchism is to claim that there is no, or to reject the sort of the positivistic idea of a rational truth of social relations, or a kind of a natural tendency towards cooperation and mutual aid, or even a certain kind of faith in humanity, which classical anarchists maintain would lead to a system of social relations which could replace the state. So, to put it simply, classical anarchism had a relatively benign and kind of positive view of human nature. Human beings were naturally cooperative, and this kind of system of, or this system of relations could actually, in a way, replace the state. I think post-anarchism probably casts some doubt over this sort of relatively sort of positive conception of human nature. It would say that human beings are certainly susceptible to the temptations of power and domination and authority. So it has a very different kind of notion of subjectivity. And I think in light of this, we have to ask ourselves whether we can actually make the same assumptions about subjectivity which were held by the classical anarchists of the 19th century. Starting with Stirner, who, as I said, argued that the figure of man was an ideological illusion, through to Foucault, who rejected any idea of a universal subject behind the various ways in which the subject has been historically constituted by regimes of power and discourse and truth. Through these various thinkers that I'm talking about, the unity of the subject as a kind of a trans-historical entity has been placed in doubt. One of the key points to be taken from Foucault and from many other post-structuralist thinkers is that there can be no ontological separation between the subject and the external forces, including power, which constitute that subject. Right? So in other words, the subject who resists power is also in part constituted by power. Right? You find this also in Lacan through the idea of discourse and the symbolic order, as well as Deleuze and Guattari, who would say that desire itself is a kind of a multiplicity of social forces which kind of cut across and fragment the individual. So in all of these thinkers, there's a questioning of the idea of the subject as a kind of a sort of a trans-historical entity which is outside of discourse and power. Added to this is also the question of whether there are privileged revolutionary identities today, and whether radical politics should be based upon identity at all. In late modernity, the revolutionary subject is unclear and ambiguous. We can no longer have much faith in the idea of a revolution of, for instance, the working class, the whole of the working class against capitalism. This narrative of the proletarian revolution doesn't really work anymore, does it? It's not really convincing anymore. On the other hand, I think it's a mistake to seek an alternative to this idea of the working class struggle in the politics of the recognition of certain marginalised identities, even in the so-called politics of intersectionality. Post-structuralism has, in my view, wrongly come to be associated with the politics of identity and difference. I think it goes very much beyond this, I would say. And I think the politics of identity and difference, what we call identity politics today, is nothing more than a kind of a liberal or neoliberal biopolitics that does little to challenge the structures of domination and capitalism. So I think post-structuralism is actually a refusal of identity politics, and is better thought about in terms of a politics of singularity and becoming. As Foucault put it, in quotes, maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, but to refuse who we are. Right? So it's not about discovering some kind of identity, whether it's gay or straight or male or female. It's about reconstructing or recreating identity, reimagining identity. It's not about releasing certain essential desires. It's about creating new ways of being, new ways of living, new ways of relating to others. The second area of inquiry is with regard to the nature and functioning of power itself. Radical theory has to come to terms with the fact that the operation of power has radically changed in late modernity. It's no longer possible to see power relations as centralized within the state, and moreover, it's no longer possible to see power as functioning only in terms of law, prohibition, and repression. The transition from the old sovereign paradigm of law, constraint, and violence to the modern paradigm of disciplinary and biopolitical power, or biopower as Foucault called it, has been well charted by Foucault and other thinkers. Not only are power relations coextensive with society and dispersed throughout everyday relations and social institutions and practices, but power itself is also has a certain kind of productive positivity. Power produces desires, affects, knowledge, and subjectivity itself, as well as freedom and resistance to it. So no longer, in other words, can we imagine a political field which is defined by an opposition between society on the one hand and the state on the other, or between the people on the one hand and hierarchically organised sovereign institutions on the other, as the anarchists of the 19th century would have proposed. Of course, I'm not saying that the state no longer exists. Obviously, state domination continues, and the spectre of authoritarian sovereignty seems to return in various states of exception, as we've seen in the context of the pandemic. So I'm not saying that these forms of power have actually gone away, but to some degree they've been supplanted or overridden by much more subtle, decentralized, and horizontally organized systems of power, where it's not about coercive violence, for instance. It's more about surveillance and various forms of subtle control. So in the age of networked communicative capitalism, the nodes and centres of power become more diffuse, decentralised and amorphous. Power takes the form of a horizontal network of relations, of multiple and overlapping circuits of digital control and surveillance in which movements and interactions are monitored and preferences and behaviours are shaped through the control of information, data flows, predictive algorithms, etc. For these reasons, I think post-structuralism places in doubt the very idea of revolution itself, if by revolution we understand a kind of a total emancipation or a total transformation of all social, political and economic conditions and the complete liberation from power. Where and how a revolution can emerge from a field invested by power relations and what it's able to achieve is a question we have to ask ourselves today. Power is more productive, as Foucault claimed, perhaps it's more productive, as Foucault claimed, to think in terms of localized forms of resistance and practices of freedom rather than the great revolutionary event. Even if it's possible for these localized forms of resistance to converge with one another to effect changes at the broader social level, the idea of a fully liberated society, in other words, a society without power, without power relations, has to be seen as a utopian fantasy. Power is coextensive with society. Power is society, in other words. There will always be power relations in any post-revolutionary form of society, which is why it's better to think not in terms of liberation, but of ongoing practices of freedom which maintain a kind of an agonistic relation to power. And indeed, the very concept of freedom can no longer be, if you like, seen as ontologically different from power, but is only intelligible in relation to power, and exists as part of a strategic game conducted in the field of power relations. Now, I think taking this notion of power as horizontal, as amorphous, as based upon surveillance and control is also something which is reflected in, so this is a picture of Kazumi Malevich, one of the Russian suprematists in the early 20th century, who was very much inspired by Max Stirner. But I wanted to talk about the artist Hito Steyerl, a German artist, and she had an exhibition some time ago now, 2013, called How Not to Be Seen, which is a kind of a critical reflection on the societies of surveillance and control, which I've been highlighting here, right? So that's just one example of how art's kind of problematizing the whole relationship of visibility and transparency and surveillance. Okay, I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so ontological anarchy, or what Foucault calls anarchaeology. So many of these ideas that I've been talking about, this kind of shift from anarchism to post-anarchism, is reflective of a condition that can be referred to as ontological anarchy. The Heideggerian thinker Rainer Sherman defines anarchy, what he calls anarchy, as a withering away of the epochal first principles, in other words, of the arche, which defines metaphysical thinking. For Sherman, this is an experience of freedom. So anarchy for him is an experience of freedom. It frees action from its telos. In other words, it frees action from a certain kind of set goal or fixed normative frameworks, or from the rule of ends, which hitherto sought to determine it. Action becomes anarchic, which is to say groundless and without a predetermined end or predetermined goal. Importantly, Sherman differentiates this notion of anarchy from the political ideas and programs of the anarchist theoreticians like Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Proudhon, who on Sherman's reading simply sought to replace one founding principle, the political authority of the state, with another, which was that of rationality. And he said Sherman said this is as metaphysical an operation as there has ever been. So in other words, the classical anarchists of the 19th century were still metaphysicians. They were simply seeking to replace the principle of sovereignty or state authority with that of rationality and morality. But it's simply one, sort of substitution for another, if you like. One principle being substituted for another. Whereas, Sherman's talking about a kind of a form of ontological anarchy. In other words, a certain kind of anarchism of how should I put it, or the absence or the removal or the weakening of the very foundations of reality itself. We can no longer rely, in other words, on fixed moral and rational principles to guide our politics. And this is what makes politics today so difficult, so tricky, so ambiguous. So, how should we understand this principle of anarchy in political terms? How does it translate into politics? Very difficult question. Foucault, in one of his lectures at the Collège de France from 1979 to 1980, described his methodological approach as anarchaeology. So, anarchy on the one hand and archaeology on the other, the anarchaeological approach. And it starts from the presupposition that there is no universal, immediate and obvious right that can everywhere and always support any kind of relation of power. This is not the same thing, he says, as saying that all power is bad, right? Rather, it means that no form of power is automatically legitimate, automatically admissible, or automatically incontestable. So the ethico-political standpoint is one which is largely consistent, I would say, with most forms of anarchism. But where it differs from anarchism is in making the non-acceptability of power one's point of departure rather than one's end point. In other words, perhaps we need to think of anarchism today not so much as a specific revolutionary politics, or rather a specific revolutionary project, but rather as an open and contingent form of action which takes the non-acceptance of power as its starting point. Can we understand anarchism as a politics that starts rather than necessarily finishes with anarchy? So perhaps contemporary forms of anarchism should be seen not as predetermined by fixed objectives, but rather as based upon a certain contingency, open-endedness and freedom of thought and action. It does not have a predetermined ideological shape, in other words, but can take many different forms and follow different courses of action. It might resist and contest specific relations of power at localized points of intensity on the basis of their illegitimacy and violence. It might work against certain institutions and institutional practices by either working within and in support of other kinds of institutions, or through creating alternative practices and forms of organisation. In other words, taking anarchy or non-power as its starting point rather than its finishing point, post-anarchism as a form of experimental and autonomous thinking and action can work on multiple fronts in a variety of different settings, a variety of different institutional and non-institutional settings, producing reversals and interruptions of existing relations of domination. So rather than thinking of post-anarchism as a distinct project, it seems more useful today to think in terms of certain modes of thought and action and creative endeavours through which relations of domination in their specificity are interrogated, contested, and where possible, overturned. So what's central for me in anarchism is the idea of autonomous thinking and acting, which transforms social relations and social spaces in the present, but which is at the same time contingent and in a sense not being subject to predetermined logics and goals. This does not mean, of course, that anarchism should not have ethical principles, but rather that it should not, and perhaps any longer cannot, see itself as a specific program of revolution and political organisation. So what I'm pointing to here is a certain kind of flexibility in anarchism, or perhaps what philosopher Kazumi Malevich calls its plasticity. Very interesting idea, plasticity. And just recently, actually, I mean, she's become more and more interested in anarchism. Yeah, exactly, that's right. Yeah, that's right, indeed, yes. In a recent interview, she said in response to a question about how she thinks about plasticity, she said the following, very interesting quote, which I'm just going to read out here. What would interest me is to see how we can solve the contradiction philosophically and politically of why we resist plasticity. So why do we resist this idea of flexibility, contingency, ontological anarchy, as I've called it? She goes on, how is it that some people can still be in control in a very non-plastic way of plasticity itself? How does this lead to fascisms and new forms of extreme authoritarian regimes which all define themselves as anti-plastic? Right? In other words, based upon conservative values, traditional structures, patriarchal structures, etc. I would expect different ways of exploring what I now call the possibility of anarchy. So she, in other words, she quite explicitly associates plasticity with anarchy and indeed with a certain kind of anarchism. So it would seem that the implications of ontological anarchy, or plasticity as she calls it, in radical politics are highly ambiguous. On the one hand, anarchism has to embrace the experience of anarchy and no longer rely on firm ontological foundations once provided by humanism. The experience of the contemporary world suggests that the tectonic plates of our age are shifting, that familiar and once hegemonic institutions, principles and philosophical categories, whether they're economic, political or even anthropological, that these ideas and institutions appear increasingly empty, lifeless and obsolete, or at the very least are in a state of crisis, a crisis of legitimacy. Never has political and financial power been in a more precarious position. COVID in a way has kind of created a crisis of legitimacy, not just for the state, but for all kinds of institutions and forms of economic organisation. Very ideas we used to have about the economy are now all completely up for grabs, aren't they? And all being radically questioned in a very fundamental way. Never before have we been confronted in such a dramatic way with the extreme consequences of the Anthropocene condition, right? Where the very survival of the species, including our own, is threatened. And this makes possible and indeed necessitates new and more autonomous forms of action, communication, economic exchange, and being in common. On the other hand, this sense that we all have of an increasingly dislocated world, spinning out of control, fragmenting, breaking up before our very eyes, is another understanding of anarchy. Right? This is the anarchy in the bad sense, perhaps. A fragmenting world. And this confronts us with immense and unparalleled dangers. The empty nihilism and destructiveness of the global capitalist machine. And here the Anthropocene is always to be thought in relation to what's called the Capitalocene. And also the appearance of apocalyptic and fascistic forms of politics which seem to be intent upon, hastening the coming disorder. If you look at the politics of Trump and, right-wing populism of various kinds, it has a certain kind of nihilism to it, doesn't it? It wants to accelerate the destructive processes of capitalism. It wants to exploit the last remaining parts, bits of the Earth's natural resources. It wants to hasten the environmental apocalypse. It wants to bring it on rather than to try to prevent it. So it wants to hasten the coming disorder. The condition of ontological anarchy is always accompanied by the temptation to restore the principle of authority to fill in its empty place with new proliferations of power. So we realise to some degree that power itself has become dangerously anarchic in various kinds of ways. And against this blind and nihilistic drive, anarchism, or what I'm getting arrested for, I'm really. I think art has an important role to play here in at least kind of drawing attention to it and somehow, possibly proposing alternatives to it. So.
I'd like to ask, what is the post-anarchist and critical art position on national identity and nationalism, and is it any way different from classical anarchism?
It's no, it rejects. It's just as hostile to nationalism as classical anarchism. This is the one probably. Well, it shares many things with classical anarchism, but it certainly has a kind of an internationalist and, if you like, cosmopolitan perspective. But it's not about a kind of a liberal cosmopolitan or global order as an alternative to nationalism. It's about I think, as I said, creating new kinds of relationships which are no longer, as it were, bound up with the nation state. Just to give you an example, Voina, the remnants of Voina basically travel around Europe without a passport. They manage to somehow cross borders, and they live this kind of constantly sort of nomadic existence. They steal from supermarkets and. I was reading this article about them actually. They kind of live on sort of caviar and fine French food, which they just steal stuff from supermarkets. But they are rootless and nomadic. They travel around without official documentation, without passports, probably without COVID vaccines as well. And so in a way they kind of live the lives of the ancient cynics that without material possessions, without national identity, without being rooted in a certain kind of place. It was Diogenes who said, I'm a citizen of the world, rather than a citizen of a polis or a citizen of a kind of a nation state. So I think Vaughan is a very good example of how the nation state is or can be deterritorialized by these kinds of sort of nomadic movements and practices. And there's a question here at the front.
Thanks for the great lecture.
Thank you.
I really admire the gesture that you made an effort or courage to connect some dialectical materialist theories with the philosophy of Agamben, let's say, because we know that mostly his concepts like inoperativity relies on Aristotelian thesis about potentiality, which is, I cannot say plausible or applicative on arts, let's say. It's really safe on theories based, but on arts it's really hard to make a real example of it.
Yes.
And my observation is the general and wider frame of the term flexibility, because anarchism as such is negation to something. So it's really concrete and really contextual, always, in all these cases that you showed. Some of them are antagonistic, some of them are agonistic, even nihilistic. So I would, I don't know, maybe we can go one to every sample that you showed, but I really have question, what is post-anarchistic on the chance bright, let's say, that case that you showed, and do you think that this concept that you come to like posteriori to praxis is anticipating critical art, or is this reflecting? Because also we can see that Voina, let's say, you said that they are not reflexive, that they don't reflect, but that these arts, these samples create new spaces, new way of thinking. Some of them, like Voina samples, are really reflecting. And can you explain a little more about how they create new spaces in real context?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, obviously, when they're, this is obviously drawing attention to the exploitation of migrant workers and to the reality of, migrant exploitation in not just in Russia, but all over the world. And I mean, so I suppose, what I would say is that, I mean, yes, they're reflecting a social reality, but they're also, in staging this kind of very dramatic kind of intervention, they're also, in a supermarket, right? I mean, they're also kind of disrupting space in a sense. They're kind of dislocating the established order of things. I mean, in a way, yes. I mean, it's creating a kind of a certain sort of, shocking effect, which is kind of designed to sort of, dislodge our reality and therefore to kind of make us think differently. So it's more than just simply a depiction of reality. It's kind of, it's trying to kind of, if you like, dislodge the aesthetic register in the sense that it's creating an intervention or a spectacle where it precisely should not be, right? I mean, all of these examples and interventions are, challenging state authority as well as capitalism in various kinds of ways. I suppose by bringing the work of art into the public space in a way which is totally inappropriate, totally scandalous. They're kind of, if you like, disrupting our existing reality, and therefore I think, forcing us to think in a different sort of way, or at least to kind of reflect on the problems that they're exposing. By the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying that this is very different from classical anarchism. Obviously, it has references to classical anarchism in this challenge to state authority. But yeah, I just think the way in which kind of public space is kind of disrupted by these kinds of practices is very interesting and very sort of reflective of a certain kind of anarchism, a certain kind of contemporary anarchism.
I would like to ask a methodological question.
Sure.
I think this was within the post-structuralist methodology, and those that criticize the post-structuralism say it because the post-structuralists say we don't have methodology, we don't have structure, but then by denying it, they have, because they say that we don't have, and then that is the methodology with avoiding the methodology. Then is actually the problem with the anarchism and artism, the denial of anarchy, that the ultimate anarchy is that there is no anarchy, and we saw tonight how close the political elite was with this museum of contemporary art, and we see that there's almost no authenticity in the art works, and plagiarism is a sort of ultimate anarchism, and those artists which are like they're all very close to this hybrid political elite, and for this political elite, of course, there's only anarchism because no law implies for them. So do you think that maybe we should say that there is anarchism, not just by trying to define it?
So I'm just trying to be clear about what you're asking me. Are you saying that?
I think that we are denying there is any anarchism in the art world today,
right.
That it's dominating.
Right.
Rather, I think we should say that there is a lot of it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's what I was suggesting. I mean, a lot of these critical art practices are very explicitly inspired by anarchism. I mean, Voyner is a very good example of this. I mean, they are engaging in a very kind of radical critique of the state, political authority, and so on. I think what I was trying to point out was that, the other side to this question is the way in which, and I think you were alluding to this, the way in which power itself has become anarchic. To the degree that it's become, you know, dislodged from sort of fixed sort of moral and rational norms. I mean, you know, anarchy always has two sides. You know, for the classical anarchists, there's a good anarchy and the bad anarchy. You know, the bad anarchy is the sort of the instability of power, or what Hannah Arendt calls the anarchy of power, which is always very dangerous, of course. You know, and if you look at the way in which power operates, you know, it's violent, it's unstable, it leads to destruction. It detaches itself from its own kinds of norms and sort of fixed, its own kind of fixed sort of norms and moral categories. You know, the good anarchy, of course, is the alternative to that. In other words, a kind of another kind of social order which is supposed to replace the existing order of power.
I think if we put it with a historicism, in a sense of if we change the methodology into a hermeneutic one, then we can see that actually in the past anarchism was about honesty, and now it is about dishonesty.
The next question.
Maybe.
Well,
I'm not sure. Dishonesty. Maybe.
maybe
Maybe the big problem about defining all those interventions is the term art.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Many different problems arise from this applying these categories. In the case of Vojna, this is completely unnecessary. This visual intervention do not simply by being a drawing enters in the category of art. It was even more complicated when many art professionals nominated Vojna for the Kandinsky Prize. It was very interesting gesture of trying to save them from persecution on one side, and on the other it was taking the political impact of this gesture away from.
Sure.
So what do you think about this kind of unclear categorization or
Of what art actually is, yeah. I mean that's you're absolutely right. It's you know, art is something which is impossible to define, of course. I mean what we think about art, what we think constitutes art today, you know, would not fit into that definition, of course. You know, in the early 20th century. I mean, obviously the concept of art changes, but I mean, the example you point to of the nomination of Vojna for the prize, I think is illustrative of this kind of tension, or this very tricky position which contemporary artists have to sort of navigate between institutionalization and non-institutionalization, or resistance to it being institutionalized, right? There's always this kind of, you know, they're reliant upon funding, they're reliant upon institutional recognition, they're reliant upon